In this section, we're going to take a look at an application that's been around for a long time, since 1972, email. Matter of fact, it's been around so long, it's part of culture already, part of your parents' culture, since the movie You've Got Mail came out in 1998.
I go online.
Welcome.
And my breath catches in my chest until I hear three little words. You've got mail.
Now, I'll admit, this is not going to be the most exciting of all the applications that we take a look at, but it's a good example of the client-server model that we saw with HTTP. It's relatively simple, so we're going to want to take a look. We're going to focus on two things here. We're going to look at the infrastructure for email as an application, the user agent, the mail client, what you use as a user when you use email. We'll look at email servers, and we'll look at messages and message queues as well. Secondly, we'll take a look at the SMTP protocol, the Simple Mail Transfer Protocol that lies at the heart of email as an application. So let's take a look. Well, as a distributed application, email has three components. First, there's the user agent, the mail client, if you will, that you use as a user. Then there are the email servers, equivalent to the HTTP servers. And finally, there's the SMTP protocol, Simple Mail Transfer Protocol, for moving messages around to and from servers. Well, the first of these three major components is the user agent, otherwise known as a mail reader or a mail client, and that's what you use to compose, edit, and to read email. So you do that every day. The messages that are read or created by your client are actually stored on the server. An email server has two sets of messages for each user. It's got a mailbox that contains the incoming and the previously received messages for that user, and it's got a queue of messages that it's waiting to send to the destination SMTP server. And the final piece of the email infrastructure is the SMTP protocol itself. This is used to push a message either from the user agent or from a mail server to another mail server. It operates in a client-server paradigm where the client is now the sender of the email, whether it's the user agent or the sending mail server, and the server side, in a client-server sense, is the receiving mail server. Well, let's walk through an example of the various steps involved when Alice, over here on the left, wants to send an email message to Bob over here on the right, where Bob's going to read it. Now, Alice and Bob both have their own email clients, that is to say their user agents, and their own email servers where they have accounts. So let's start over here on the left-hand side. Alice first uses her mail client, her user agent, to compose an email message. She's composing the email message. Eventually, she hits send. When she hits send, Alice's email client contacts Alice's email server and pushes, that is to say transfers in a client-server model, transfers the message that Alice has written to the mail server using the SMTP, Simple Mail Transfer Protocol. We're going to take a look at that protocol in just a second. Okay, so now the message is sitting on Alice's server. The next step, Alice's server is going to contact Bob's server. We've got a server contacting a server, and the first step that Alice's server is going to do is to open up a TCP connection. In step 4, Alice's SMTP server, acting as a client, sends Alice's message over the TCP connection to Bob's email SMTP server. Bob's server then places the message in Bob's mailbox, and then at some point in the future, asynchronously, Bob's going to invoke his user agent and read Alice's message from his email server. RFC 5321 defines the SMTP protocol. SMTP operates on top of TCP, using TCP to reliably transfer email messages from client to server. Port 25 is the standard server port number associated with SMTP, so the client always knows the port number on which to contact the SMTP server. As we saw earlier, mail messages are directly transferred from the sending server, which acts like a client in this case, to the receiving server, to the destination server. Following the TCP setup, there are then 3 phases to message transfer. There's an SMT handshaking protocol that's shown over here on the right that involves the exchange of 3 messages. A 220 message that's initiated by the server to the client over the TCP connection. The client then says hello, and the server then says hello back. Then there's the SMT transfer of messages, and finally the SMTP connection is closed, and then the TCP connection can be closed. And we'll see shortly that the command response interaction, like HTTP, consists of ASCII text, again very human readable, and a status code and a phrase as a response. Here's a sample SMTP interaction between Alice's email server acting as a client at kreps.fr with Bob's SMTP server at hamburger.edu. And what happens first following the establishment of the TCP connection is Bob's server at hamburger.edu sends a 220 message with its host name. Alice's SMTP server responds with the word hello and its host name, and then Bob's server responds back with a message that says hello to Alice's hostname, pleased to meet you. That's really the phrase that's returned with the 250 code. In the first 3 lines so far, the SMTP servers performed a handshake with each other. In lines 4 through 13 here, you can see the SMTP protocol identifying who the message is from, who the recipient is, the phrase data, which tells the server that the message itself is about to begin, and then the message itself, terminated by a line that only contains a period. Following that, the client says, I quit, I'm all done, and the server responds back with a 221 message, and at this point, the email message has been transferred and the SMTP connection has been closed. Well, before diving into the details of email message formats, let's make a few high-level observations about the SMTP protocol itself. And let's start by comparing it to HTTP. We saw that HTTP is a pull protocol. That is, the HTTP client is pulling data generally from the HTTP server, whereas SMTP is more of a push protocol. It's pushing a message from the client to the server. And again, that client could actually be a user agent, a mail client, or it could be a mail server pushing a message from that mail server to another mail server. We also noted that SMTP messages are human readable, they're encoded in ASCII format, we can look at them, understand what they do, and they have status codes, not the same status codes, but a similar idea to what we saw in HTTP. And in fact, HTTP, you can see, drew some of its inspiration from SMTP. And then finally, SMTP has multiple objects that could be encoded into one message. And in HTTP, as we saw, there's just one object in each request. SMTP uses persistent connections, meaning that multiple email messages can be transferred over a single SMTP connection. And we've seen already that SMTP requires messages to be in 7-bit ASCII human readable form, and that the message itself is terminated by a line with only a period on it. So what does a mail message format actually look like? What's the protocol for that? Well, I'm going to spare you the pain, and if you're really interested, I'm just going to point you to RFC 2822 that defines the syntax for the email message in much the same way that HTML defines the syntax for what web documents look like. In a nutshell, an email message is going to contain a header portion, which will have a to-line, a from line, and a subject line. And these lines within the body of the email are actually quite different from the SMTP mail from and receipt to commands. I know it's a little bit confusing. The header is then followed by a blank line and then the body of the message encoded in 7-bit ASCII. And again, for the details, take a look at RFC 2822. Well, all of our discussion so far is focused on pushing a mail message towards the destination SMTP server. Now suppose an email message is actually at the destination server. How is that message retrieved? Well, of course, there's a protocol for that. The Internet Message Access Protocol, IMAP, is probably the most widely used email access protocol. It's defined in RFC 3501, and you can check that out for the details. There are lots of other protocols for accessing email as well. One can also use HTTP to retrieve an email message from a web server that's also configured to return email messages. In this section, we took a quick look at one of the oldest networked applications around, email. We looked at the email infrastructure, mail servers, mail clients, message queues, things like that. And we also took a look at the SMTP protocol, the Simple Mail Transfer Protocol, which gave us another good example of a client-server type of protocol, similar in some ways to HTTP, but also different. Well, coming up next, we're going to take a look at the DNS protocol, the Domain Name System Protocol. As we'll see, it's very different from SMTP and HTTP. doesn't involve users like you and me, and it's a critical piece of core internet infrastructure.